Hello, dear viewers. We decided to go through the text of this book, Dialectics and Atheism, Two Essences Incompatible, to talk about what is written on its pages, and some citizens insisted that all this be recorded. Therefore, all this is in such a scenario-less form, but simply whatever questions arise in the course of reading the book, we simply follow the text of the book.
Page 9. I have a question. There it is about the fuss of life. If one does not perish in the fuss of life, then what results will he come to? To what?
Page 9, there is such a text. At the very beginning of this path, they get stuck in the web of the created by them themselves fuss. Since, ignoring the past experience of mankind, they automatically reproduce in their lives the delusions and mistakes of past generations, thereby aggravating life circumstances both for themselves and for subsequent generations. So, this is the phrase. Well, in general, it is clear that a person perishes in the fuss of life, even if he lives to a ripe old age, but lives the same way as past generations lived, reproducing their delusions, their mistakes, in an automatic mode, simply reproducing the wrong tradition. If a person lives outside this very fuss of life, and it does not enslave him, then he develops. The development of a person is of a directed character and is expressed in the fact that in the end he begins to live a meaningfully volitional order, realizing the creative potential for the development of society under the power of the dictatorship of Sophist. That is, if you dig into the depths of your psyche, you need to find three things: Sophist, creative potential, and will, and then to make of them this very alloy. The will realizes the creative potential under the power of the dictatorship of Sophist.
Is a factually studying doctor of philosophical sciences, professor at the Russian Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration under the President, a taking place human or not?
In general, not taking place, however sad and offensive it may be for those who might know him as a good-in-life person. The fact is that back in the 19th century, Kozma Prudkov issued the following aphorism: "The philosopher easily triumphs over the past and future sorrows, and is easily triumphed over by the present." There is a play on words in this aphorism. The past, the future, and the present can be understood as episodes in time, a link to time with a chronological axis. But the present can be understood as real, reality. The past and the future exist only as a memory, the past, and the future as an imagination about the past. Moreover, as far as the memory of the past is concerned, the memory of the past is sufficiently replaced by the play of the imagination about the past. Therefore, in the police environment, there has long been such a saying: lies like an eyewitness. If philosophy is life consistent, the arising of real grief, it is unlikely, because the future is predictable. And, before it comes in an unfavorable form, it can always be governed in such a way that some other variant of the future, in which there will be no troubles, is realized. Therefore, unfortunately, the professor, he is a professor, a doctor of sciences most likely, and so on and so forth, but he is not the carrier of that philosophy that allows one to identify problems in society and solve them in advance, in order that no troubles would arise.
Page 13. It is about methodology. I will not read everything, just an excerpt. Methodology, the only useful philosophy. Question. In my opinion, something is wrong. Is methodology really a philosophy?
Methodology is usually a part of philosophy. Moreover, if the methodology is consistent, then it generates a certain philosophy, as a set of certain opinions, patterns, formulations of these patterns. Therefore, such a formulation of methodology, being the only useful philosophy, it is generally correct, although it is not familiar to the ear, for our tradition, when methodology is a certain integral part of philosophy which who knows where it came from and how. Because, after all, actually, any philosophy is a product of the methodology of cognition, and with the right approach, any philosopher is a part of the methodology of cognition.
Is the truth multifaceted?
The truth is multifaceted. The simplest example is the Pythagorean theorem. The sum of the squares of the legs is equal to the square of the hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is the diameter of the circle that can be described around this triangle. These are different sides of the same question. The question is, what do you announce and what remains in the defaults? But the principle of complementarity of information, it still works. So the truth is multifaceted.
But the fact that the truth is, in principle, complementarity of information, does official science recognize this?
I think that it does not recognize it for the simple reason that in the majority of scientific disciplines, information is something subjective and not something that objectively exists in nature. Therefore, if information as an objective category in science is absent, then there can be no principle of complementarity of information, since the principle of complementarity of information is expressed through measure, the matrix of possible states, which, in relation to information, is a system of its coding.
Page 16, quote, "The masters of the teachings know the essence of the conception." Accordingly, the question is, what are the examples of teachings of the masters?
In the given case, this is about the fact that there are two components in culture, the exoteric, intended for everyone, and the esoteric, intended for a certain group of the chosen, who know what everyone does not know. But if we consider culture as an informational algorithmic system, then culture is integral, and in it, the exoteric component and the esoteric component, they mutually complement each other, each solving their own tasks. But those who are above exotericism and above esotericism know the full set of tasks. They provide an exoteric and esoteric component and draw the line between them. They are carriers of a different culture. There is such an aphorism somewhere on the internet. Жрецы are those who write the scriptures, and priests are those who interpret the scriptures. This is how it is. That is, the pseudo-Jrets culture, it is a pseudo-Jrets culture. It is not bound by dogmas. Yes, there are certain ethical principles, they also have their friends and foes, but there are no dogmas that inhibit. They are not and should not be there, because as soon as the inhibiting dogmas appear, a person immediately slides into either the culture of exotericism or the subculture of esotericism, depending on what dogmas they are. They are intended for the entire crowd, or they are intended for a select part of the crowd that lives in the stream of the esoteric culture.
Так, следующая, значит, страница 110. Тоже цитата. 110 страница. Определенность.
Page 110, also quote, Determinedness, anticipating the act of creation, is predetermination. Please clarify the wording.
110 страница. Определенность, упреждающий акт творения.
Let's say we are going to build a house.
Допустим, мы собрались построить домик. Домик существует?
Does the house exist? Not
Пока
yet.
нет.
We draw a blueprint for the house.
Домик существует? Физически не
Does the house exist? Physically does not exist. But if we are not completely stupid in matters of strength of materials, construction materials from which we are going to build the house already in some way exists as a potentially realizable possibility. It predetermines our creation, because without construction documentation in the prevailing culture, we will not build a house. Therefore, here is such an explanatory analogy that determinedness, anticipating the act of creation, this is predetermination, because at the stage of design, we can design a house this way and that. We can design it wooden, stone, brick, 2-story, 1-story, and so on. But we always bring determiners. We cannot design a house in general.
Мы не можем спроектировать домик вообще. Нет, домик вообще.
The house that we design is always determined, endowed with a measure. A certain measure is expressed in it. Therefore, this determinedness, anticipating the act of creation, it really is predetermination. But in the religious aspect, the predetermination of God, it preempted the act of creation of the creation in which we live, and of which our organisms are a part. And again, it is not for nothing that Pyotr Alexeyevich called the first ship of the line of the Russian fleet Goto Predestinatsia, the predetermination of God. It was not a copy of another ship, it was the first Russian battleship. It was built in Voronezh-on-Don, took part in the Russian-Turkish wars. Then, when Peter lost some battle, and, according to the peace treaty, Russia had to stop having a fleet in the Black Sea, Peter wanted to transfer her to the Baltic. But the Turks did not allow him, and she became a Turkish ship. And now in Voronezh, they made a copy of Goto Predestinatsia, and they have it there. You can watch it on the internet. In appearance, the ship corresponds to that shown on the engravings of the times of Peter the Great. She was a really beautiful for her time ship. The engravings are beautiful, good, I like it. As for the design, by all appearances, if the builders of Goto Predestinatsia saw a copy, they would express a lot of claims. And in some ways they would be surprised, because those technologies, the culture of production that existed then, it is now lost. And we can ensure the appearance, but we cannot provide a reliable copiedness. Moreover, many design solutions are variable, and those design solutions that were on a particular ship, now only some clairvoyants will see.
Page 124. Someone's autocracy is illusory and acts only within the established for it boundaries of God's allowance. Where are these boundaries if so much evil is going on in the world?
First, the Almighty bestows His power on whomever He wishes, the Quran. That is, if a person stabs someone, then he acts within the boundaries of allowance. Why?
Понимаете,
You see,
если
if a person was
человеку
given freedom of
предоставлена
choice,
свобода
then
выбора,
along with it,
то
on the
вместе
principle
с
of
ней в
complementarity of
отличие от
information,
поверхностности
the right to
информации
make a mistake was given.
предоставлено право на ошибку. Если
If
предоставлено
everyone is
право на
given the right to
ошибку
make a
всем и
mistake,
каждому, то
then there is an area of
является
erroneous
достаточным
actions of each
действием
and every
у
one,
каждого,
which in the
которое в
religious
религиозной
tradition
традиции
is called
почему-то
God's allowance.
называется
That
божеским
is, God
попущением.
grants the right to make
Бог
mistakes to people
предоставляет право
up to direct
ошибаться людям,
abuse.
вплоть до прямых злоупотреблений. Но Бог
But God
никогда не
never
обещал,
promised that
что
He
люди
would do for
будут
people
делать то,
what they
что
can
они
and should do
должны
themselves.
делать.
If the
Если
herd pack monkey of the
поставить
species
на
Homo sapiens
влияние вида Homo
did not take place
sapiens
as a
не
human,
состоялось
then
в
God can
отношении
endure it.
человека, то Бог может это перетерпеть. Но человеком эта
But this
обезьяна
monkey
должна стать
must
сама.
become a human by
Для
itself.
этого все
For
дано.
this, everything is
Разум дан,
given.
чувства
Reason
даны,
is given,
воля
senses are
дана,
given, will is given,
совесть, как
Sovest,
индикатор
as an indicator of distinguishing
добра и
between
зла
dobro
дана.
and evil,
Если
is given.
совесть
If the
проспала
Sovest
или
has
была
overslept
подавлена,
or has
то
been
есть
suppressed,
иммунитет.
then there is also
Действует
shame,
так же, как
which acts the same way as Sovest in the sense of distinguishing between dobro and evil. Only Sovest acts proactively in relation to events, and shame post factum. When we have messed up, then we are ashamed. Moreover, what is shame? In general, it really is a terrible thing, because even in cultures where suicide is viewed as a sin, for which the retribution is eternal hell, people go to suicide out of shame. That is, shame is even worse than eternal hell. Much of what we perceive as unpraviousness is an external stimulus, so that we do not get bogged down in the hustle and fuss. And this external stimulus encourages us to develop. If we cannot develop on the basis of inherent love, internal motivation, then external stimuli, which we perceive in some cases as disasters and misfortunes, they push us to ensure that we develop. Hence the saying that what does not kill us makes us stronger. This is exactly as an external stimulus. This is often the case. If you analyze your life, then everyone will find something in it, some kind of trouble, as a result of which, in the end, some kind of positive effect was achieved. But a person could not have come to this positive effect without these troubles, because before the troubles and their recomprehending, he was different and he had other interests. Some meaning must be derived from these troubles, which will encourage development.
Page 163. With the acquisition of freedom of will, the need to do something, exerting volitional force over oneself, disappears. Explain the wording.
When does the need for will arise in us? When something doesn't go by itself. Then we take ourselves up and do something. Or, on the contrary, we take ourselves up and do not do something. Because the will, often enough, and in the most important cases, manifests itself not in the fact that we are doing something very persistently, but in the fact that in the critical moment we refuse to do something stupid or villainous, like everyone else. What is freedom? Freedom is given by God, guidance by Sovest. If a person reaches the level of this freedom here, his will becomes free. But the second aspect of freedom is the absence of overwhelming resistance. And in general, it turns out that in this case, everything is easy in life, like sailing. The wind drives the boat, and the boat, in general, sails by herself, without exerting her own efforts, with the exception of a certain part of the efforts that are aimed at governing the sails. That is, you spend some energy on governing your own organism, and everything else in general, in external activity, happens as if by itself, but with your participation. And the activity does not exhaust you, well, at least within the biorhythmics of sleep and wakefulness.
I know a number of professors, doctors, who can barely make ends meet, but they consciously lead this line in order to change those life circumstances that not only surround them, but surround the country in which they all live. That is, they do not consciously manifest will.
ту страну, в которой они все живут. То есть несознательно идут на
So they did not reach the regime in which freedom of sophist, freedom of will, is a reality.
Свобода совести, это свобода воли, это вот реальность.
Because if this regime is achieved,
Этот режим достигнут, то тогда
then whatever you do, people come to you who want to help, or whose activities, regardless of their desire and non-desire, is, however, a contribution to the cause in which you are engaged.
вкладом в то дело, которое делаешь ты.
And with our professors, the situation is such that, in fact, all social science and sociological knowledge is falsification. This is a lot of demagoguery from which it is impossible to extract the life meaning. So, how can you understand the phrase from our political science textbook, "The state is a concentrated expression of the idea of the political"? Yes, this phrase is a science-like allusion to certain circumstances. If you have a sufficient culture of senses in order to feel these circumstances and speculatively see, then you will accept this phrase and say, yes, the state is a concentrated expression of the idea of the political. But if you approach this obtusely from a natural scientific standpoint, then you ask the teacher a question. Please tell me, in what way will we measure the concentration of an idea? And second, what device will we use to measure the concentration of an idea? And after that, the teacher will climb up the wall, because such a lowering of him at the lecture is not provided for by the scenario of the educational and pedagogical process of higher school.
Вот. А если наука,
And if science, knowledge, that a person carries is life consistent, then there are generally no such problems.
в общем-то, нет.
Because there are many people who are faced with problems and who are interested in seeing these problems solved.
Которые заинтересованы в том, чтобы эти проблемы были решены.
And when the carrier of knowledge informs such a person that there are recipes like this, then very often it turns out that the one who is offered a solution is simply cowardly and does not want to implement it. Because, unfortunately, patriotism in Russia, it is very often a willingness to save the motherland in a good feast with a delicious snack and a drink, preferably under the protection of special forces. But if you have to lie down on the embrasure, then we look where Sasha Matrosov is.
То смотрим, где Саша Матросов.
And again, on this theme, it was 1828, the Russian-Turkish War. The brig Mercury, 20 bullseye cannons, fought off 2 Turkish battleships.
20 пушечек калибром с яблочко отбился от
According to
двух
Turkish data,
линейных
both were
кораблей.
3-decker
По
and
турецким
110
данным, оба
cannon.
были трехдечные
According to our
линкоры
data,
50
one was
пушек.
110
По
cannon
нашим
rank
данным, один
and the other was of
трехстанковый
84
линкор
cannon
был
rank.
84-пушечного ранга. Вот то, что
The
Брик
fact
в
that the brig
одиночку отбился
single-handedly
от
fought
двух
off 2
линейных
ships of the
кораблей, это
line is
противоестественно.
unnatural from the point of view of that
С точки
era.
зрения той эпохи. Почему он отбился? Ну,
Why did
Казарский,
she fight
который
back?
командовал бригом, был
Kazarsky, who commanded the
выдающийся
brig,
тактик,
was an outstanding tactician.
поэтому он смог
Therefore,
организовать бой
he
таким
was able to
образом,
organize the
чтобы
battle in such a
могли
way
реализовать
that the
свое
Turks could not
преимущество.
realize their overwhelming
И
advantage.
возникает
But
вопрос,
the question
почему мы не
arises,
видим
why do
Казарского
we not see
спустя 20
Kazarsky
лет
20 years
среди
later among
адмиралов
the
флота?
admirals of the Russian fleet?
Ответ простой. После
The
боя
answer is simple.
Казарский
After
стал
the battle,
доверенным лицом
Kazarsky became
императора
a
Николая
confidant of
I.
Emperor Nikolai I,
И он послал
and he
его
sent him with an
с
audit to the
дивизией
Black Sea
в
region.
Причерноморье. И там его
And there they
ограбили.
poisoned him,
И он в
and he
гробу
lay
лежал
purple in the
мертвый.
coffin. This is to the question that a man came through a battle from which it seemed he was not supposed to get out, without a single scratch, and they killed him. And if you look through Russian history, then there are more than enough such facts, because the main property of the Russian elite is boundless filthiness. Boundless, outrageous filthiness, scoundrelism, armed with practically unlimited omnipotence in society. And therefore the cyclics of Russian history is simple. As soon as an elite corporative state arises, the country begins to degrade and comes to a collapse. After the collapse, Minin and Pozharsky were required several centuries ago, or Stalin, Dzerzhinsky and other Bolsheviks. Then the country reaches a certain heyday. Then the elite is formed again. The elite says we are better than them, they are cattle, and it goes again to a new disaster. Economics does not dictate politics. Economics constrains politics and supports politics. But as far as politics is concerned, politics is primarily political will. Political will is obviously conditioned. And politics includes in itself three components: global, the objectives that we pursue in relation to all humanity; external, the objectives that we pursue in interrelations with other states; internal, objectives that we pursue within our jurisdiction. Politics needs economic support. Economic support is varied, from a cannon, a tank, a ship, to a typewriter, office supplies, any documentation that, although it is information, nevertheless needs some kind of material carriers that the economy must produce. And the possibilities of the economy often limit the possibilities of politics. But if there is political will, we develop the economy in such a way that the politics we want can be provided economically. If we don't want to, then we say, the global financial economic crisis has had an impact on Russia, therefore all citizens except the elite, tighten your belts, there is no money, but you hold on. The question is money rain, dew of God, solar energy, or Elvira Sakibzadovna waves the paper and money appears, refuses to wave it and money does not appear? The next question is, for what is money paid? Generally speaking, the director, Kirill Serebrennikov, is accused of having stolen 67 million state budget rubles. The question is, what did they allocate this money for? It turns out that the money was allocated so that in the play Nureyev, the audience was shown a naked ass, and in the play Antony and Cleopatra, a man with a dummy of such a member would appear on the stage. That is, the money was allocated for the corruption of society, and this was state politics. They knew what they were allocating it for. There was probably a casting, and they knew their inclinations. And the claims are not reduced to the fact that he was engaged in purpose-oriented corruption of society, but to the fact that he, the bastard, stole the money allocated for the corruption of society, or helped to ensure that, with his connivance, the money was stolen. For what is money paid? Because if we invest money in education, in the performance speed of the system of state governance, we work for development. If we invest money in athletes, then we work for degradation, because athletes do not create anything. If we invest money in the development of document circulation, then we divert labor resources from solving urgent tasks of development, and they are engaged in all sorts of nonsense, but not in a real cause. During the time, for 10 years already, that I've been working in the system of higher education, the volume of waste paper that needs to be done and redone annually, it has grown many times, 3 or 4 times. And what does it boil down to? There were standards 3, the third generation. Then 3 plus appeared. All documentation related to the teaching of academic disciplines should be reviewed and brought into formal compliance with these standards. Who is looking at this formal documentation? Inspectors who themselves do not know anything in academic disciplines. That is, people are engaged in frankly useless activities to the detriment of useful labor. So everything is simple here.
True, inspired by God's wisdom. What is it?
That which you are doing is in accordance with your service. If service is an innate religious sense, then if you are inspired and act according to your service, and put your intellect in order, then you are unlikely to mess up.
Then I don't understand the professors, because I feel that they are really sincerely trying to change something.
You see, sincerity does not guarantee. Remember the scene from the movie That Same Munchausen, where the pastor gnaws at the oils and says the phrase, "Yes, but we were sincere in our delusions." In delusions, you can also be sincere. You can be sincerely blago-intentioned, but incapable of blago-doingness.
Page 192. It is about the collision of the Shoemaker-Levy 9 comet with the planet Jupiter in 1994. And in dialectics, it is asserted that this collision was of a demonstrational notificational character in relation to humanity. The question is, of what character then are the rest of the comets in endless space in relation to humanity?
Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9. There are 2 cadres that saw it through a telescope and named it after themselves. 9 is the number, since one of them had managed to see 8 comets before. It hit Jupiter. The area of collision with Jupiter was larger in diameter than the diameter of the Earth.
То есть она, попав в
That
Юпитер,
is,
нарушила
it, having
структуру
collided with
его
Jupiter,
атмосферы,
violated the structure of its
площадь
atmosphere
которой по
in an
диаметру
area that is larger in
превосходит
diameter
Землю.
than the Earth.
Вот. И,
And
соответственно, если
accordingly,
бы эта
if this
комета
comet had
попала не
collided
в
not with
Юпитер, а в
Jupiter but with
Землю,
the Earth,
то
then now
сейчас
we would
мы
not
бы
be sitting here
посидели
not
и
discussing what
обсуждали
this
то, что это
means.
значит.
Ну так в дальнем космосе там и звезды взрываются, и галактики сталкиваются.
And the
Ну,
Earthlings
это
were
не
shown
дальний
that,
космос.
guys,
В
if you
этом приборе
misbehave, this can
показано
happen on
явно,
Earth.
что,
But for the
ребята, в случае,
majority,
если вы
this is
будете
not
плохо
causally
себя
connected
вести,
in any way.
такое может произойти и на Земле.
This
Но
is not a
для
demonstration
большинства
of what will
это,
happen if
почему
humanity
в
follows a
тексте так и
dead-end path.
сказано, это не демонстрация того, что будет. Если
Because, as one of the anecdotes on
просто
the internet goes,
пошли по тупиковому пути. Потому
after we meet
что
with
предложить
extraterrestrial
ответ с
intelligence,
интернета
we will have to
невозможно.
explain
После
for a long
того, как мы
time why
встретимся
we
с
made such
этим
films
единым
about them
разумом,
in
нам
which they are such
придется долго
villains.
объяснять, почему мы снимали о них такие фильмы, в которых они такие злодеи. Вот это
This villainy,
злодейство,
it will not
оно
be
не
released
будет
into space,
выпущено в космос.
because the universe is reasoning. It will
Вселенная
not give
разум
this to
нам не
happen.
даст.
И исходя из этого можно сделать такой вывод.
Да, исходя из этого, этика
Based on
не
this, we can draw the following
пределами
conclusion.
человеческого общества.
Ethics is not localized within the boundaries of human society. Ethics goes beyond the boundaries of human society and enters human society from the outside. Ethics is universal in character. And now, if this is understood, and it's understood how humanity lives on planet Earth, then the collision of Shoemaker Levi's comet with Jupiter is a demonstration of the capabilities of the universe on the theme of how villainy, if it is not unreasoned, can be suppressed.
Then is it possible to put the identity between the cosmos and God? So God sent the comet.
No. The universe as a whole is reasoning. If we deify the universe, this is called pantheism. God is everything. Abrahamic beliefs stand on the other, that God is not of this world, he is outside of creation. But creation was created by him, proceeding from his objectives. One of the objectives is the development of mankind to a certain new quality in which mankind will be able to solve some other tasks that now we cannot even envision. But the universe as a whole is reasoning, and if this was a self-evident fact in pagan times, then, under the pressure of circumstances, the science of atheistic civilization also came to the conclusion that the human intellect is not unique. And academician Amosov, the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences in Soviet times, a doctor and cybernetician, he directly wrote that the laws of intellect are one for human intellect and for animal intellect, for artificial intellect, for the collective intellect of society. Well, it only remained to take the last step. For any intellects in creation, the laws are the same. Intellect is a pan-natural phenomenon, and the only question is, on what medium is intellect localized? So intellect can be localized on one carrier, but there can be many carriers that carry one intellect. Each of the carriers can be intellectless. But if there are many individual intellectual carriers, then, when they organize the exchange of information with each other, they generate collective intellect. In human society, if this collective intellect is all subordinate to sophist, then it is a subornal intellect. And if there is no sophist, then there may be collective schizophrenia, when part of the intellect wants one thing, and part of the same intellect wants something else. You need to decide on your desires in order to form a subornal intellect. In general, everyone must begin to live according to their sovest. Then a subornal intellect is formed as a part of subornost. Subornost in the Russian language is a word that defines a collective psyche in which there are no internal conflicts, in which every thought, every will, in some way complements the other and is based on the thoughts and wills of others. It is a holistic, internally conflict-free system. There can be no disagreements, because Sovest is an innate religious sense. God is not a schizophrenic.
Page 202. The footnote explains the interconnection between Marxism in Russia with Hitlerism. Please explain this interconnection in some other way.
Так, сейчас посмотрим, что тут. Да, в примечании.
The text mentioned that the boys from the Hitler Youth and the kamikaze as patriots of their countries. Patriotism is not necessarily pravious. Patriotism can be unpravious. It is simply a concern for one's homeland and a willingness to sacrifice one's life for this very homeland. And if now there is such an opportunity, in Soviet times there was not. It was just that the French magazine, Paris Match, somehow accidentally came across where a group of Japanese kamikaze guys was photographed on the deck of an aircraft carrier before the last flight. The photo was very high quality, and you could look the guys in the eyes. Each of them is personally worthy of respect. Well, the system that sent them to their death is worthy of the crudest censure and uprooting. That is what was meant. For the fact that Hitlerism arose, Russia really bears a certain share of responsibility. In what sense? Rosenberg grew up and studied in Russia. One of the relatives of Bormann owned a chocolate factory in Russia. Ribbentrop also grew up in Russia. That they dared to assess Russia as a country of inferior people it means that there were some prerequisites for this in what they saw in the country. What did they see in the country? The following facts are known. The Russo-Japanese War. Before the Russo-Japanese War, Russia orders 3 cruisers from Germany. Bogatyr, Askolt, and Novik. The main observer who controlled the construction of Novik in Germany was surprised by the following fact. The Germans do not have chisels and sledgehammers on these slipways. The sheet is fed onto the slipway with holes drilled for rivets. All the holes coincide with each other. In Russia, the sheet was cut approximately, fed onto the slipway. Holes for rivets were drilled on the slipway, on site. The sheet was fixed with rivets, where necessary. And after, the excess metal was cut off. This is the level of technology. Further, the cruiser Bogatyr was built. She safely went to the Far East, where the navigators safely put her on the stones. And, in general, she stood in the dock for repairs during the entire Russo-Japanese War, not participating in battles. Moreover, if we analyze the number of navigation losses, then there are too many of them. That is, the losses conditioned by navigational errors. They are commensurate with the damage inflicted by the Japanese. Bogatyr returned from the Far East to the Baltic without any problems, and after that she changed her team and went on a foreign voyage with the cadets of the Cadet Corps.
Но потому
But
что
according to
самому
the same
поэту в
project,
России
several
было
cruises were
построено
built in
несколько
Russia.
крейсеров.
Among them are
Среди них
Oleg
Олег
and
и
Achakov.
Очаков. Олег
Oleg took
участвовал
part
в
in the Battle
всяких
of Tsushima.
сражениях. До Цусимы
She
он
barely crawled to
еле-еле
Tsushima
дополз, потому
because the
что
mechanisms were
механизмы
constantly
постоянно
breaking down.
выходили из строя. Но он
She
выдержал
withstood the
титаническое
Battle of
сражение.
Tsushima.
После того,
After the
как
war
война
ended, she
закончилась,
also
он
returned to the Baltic.
перемещался на Балтику. Он не смог дойти
She
до
could not reach
Балтики
the
с
Baltic from
дальними
the Far
маршрутами.
East. She somehow
Кое-как
crawled to
дополз до
Algeria.
Алжира. В
In
Алжире
Algeria, she
простоял
stood for a month or
месяц или
two
два в
under repair.
ремонте. После
After
ремонта
repairs,
дополз
she
до
crawled to the
Балтики,
Baltic,
и на
and in the
Балтике
Baltic she
стал
began to
изучать
undergo
Балтику.
major repairs.
Вот если
Now, if all the Ribbentrops,
всякие там
Rosenbergs,
Риббентропы,
and others
Розенберги
there
и
saw all
прочие
this
все
in
это
Russia with their
видели
own
в
eyes,
Россию воочию, то они
then they had
имели
every right to
полное
say
право
that this is a
говорить о
country of
том, что это
fools and
страна
scoundrels.
дураков и негодяев. Это расовая
These are racially
неполноценная
inferior
страна.
guys,
Не вникая
without
в
delving into the
вопросы
question
почему
of
это
why
так.
this is so.
Да, русский дух им
Yes,
был
the Russian
недоступен,
spirit was
поэтому
inaccessible to them.
Бисмарка они не
Therefore,
понимали.
they did not
Ребята,
understand
не
Bismarck
ходите
that,
туда,
guys, do
потому
not go
что
there,
даже если вы
because even if
дойдете
you
до
get to the
Урала, я не
Urals,
знаю, как
I
вы
do not know how you will
вернетесь
take your bones
назад.
back.
Это одна
This is
сторона
one
вопроса.
side.
Вторая
The second
сторона
side of the
вопроса –
question is
это
the
так
so-called Russian
называемая
intelligentsia.
интеллигенция. Значит,
The first
«Капитал»
volume of
был
Capital
переведен на
was
русский
translated
язык
into Russian in
в
1872. Stalin was
1872
not there at all.
году. До
Before the
революции
1905
1905
revolution,
года,
from
1972
1872,
года,
these are
33 года.
33 years.
33 года
33
было
years
как
is a quite
вполне
sufficient
достаточный
time
срок для
in order
того,
to read
чтобы
what Marx
прочитать,
wrote,
чего понаписал
correlate it
Маркс,
with life, say that this is all
соотнести это с
bull,
жизнью
we
и
don't need
сказать, что
it,
это все хрень. Нам это
and
не
roll out
надо,
a
выпустить
life-consistent alternative.
альтернативу,
It
жизненно
was not rolled out.
состоятельную. Не выкатили. Возникает вопрос,
The
где
question
творческий
arises,
потенциал,
where is the creative potential?
где
Where is
интеллектуальная
the
мощь,
intellectual power?
чья философия
Whose
представлена в
philosophy is
русской высшей
represented in Russian
школе?
higher school?
Гегель, Кант,
Hegel, Kant, Nietzsche, and all the others.
все прочие.
Well, a little
Немножко
French.
французов.
Where are the Russian
Где русские
philosophers?
философы?
What conclusion were the
Какой
Germans
вывод
supposed to
должны
draw?
были сделать немцы? Немцы сделали
The Germans
вполне
made a
логичный
completely
вывод.
logical conclusion.
Страна дураков
A
и
country of fools and
негодяев,
scoundrels,
жизненное
living space,
пространство,
forward
и вот
march before someone
это
else
никто не
occupies.
занял. И вот эти
These
обстоятельства,
circumstances
они
really place a certain amount of blame
возлагают
for what happened on
определенную
Russia,
долю
which has
вины
taken the
за
position,
произошедшее на Россию,
those
которая
great but
заняла
thick, they
позицию
take more
«так
hits.
жлоб, так больше бьют». Почему
Why she
заняла?
took this
Это другой
position
вопрос.
is another question.
Этот вопрос
This
можно
question goes
поднять
back to
в
antiquity in
до
pre-baptismal
католические
times.
времена. Ошибка была
The mistake
сделана
was made
тогда,
then,
за
for
которую
which we
мы
are still
сейчас
paying now.
расплачиваемся до сих пор. Но тем не
But,
менее, это
nevertheless,
так.
it is so.
Дальше, если
If you
посмотреть
look at the philosophy
философию
of Hegel,
Гегеля, то
then
Гегель
Hegel wrote
как
something
бы
according to which the
написал
meaning of the
нечто
activity of the
согласно
Almighty is to create a
чему
magnificent
смысл
Prussian
деятельности
state.
Всевышнего
That is,
это
no
просто
error is
руководить по
foreseen.
великолепной
And
русской
thus, Hitlerism in many ways is a continuation of
изложение
Hegelianism.
предусмотрено. И таким образом гитлеризм это
And what the
во многом
Russian thinkers wrote,
продолжение
it
гегельянства.
generally remained unrequired.
А то, что писали
Because the Russian intelligentsia, both before 1917 and now,
оставалось
in general,
невостребованной
is copying all sorts of bull from
российская
Western books.
интеллигенция, как до 17 года, так и сейчас, она, в общем-то, списывает
And if,
из
for
западных
example,
книжек всякую хрень.
Khomyakov wrote that Hegel's
Да.
philosophy is a
И
dead
если,
end,
допустим, Хомяков
then
написал,
Khomyakov
что
did not write an
философия
alternative.
Гегеля это тупик, да, то Хомяков не
But
написал
why a dead end,
альтернативу.
no one began to
И
think
почему
either.
тупик, тоже думать никто не стал.
If Ignatius Brianchaninov directly wrote that all the problems of Russia stemmed from the fact that it deviated from true Christianity, and it was necessary to return to true Christianity, then this too did not interest anyone. There were alternatives. Well, as one of the alternatives, Pirogov is not only a surgeon, Pirogov is a pedagogue. And there was a question about whether or not to make him the Minister of Public Education. Alexander II did not do this. Liesgovt, also a pedagogue. He was bullied, persecuted. Instead of saying, "Dear, thank you, train a cadre of teachers, it is necessary to lead the people out of ignorance." No, support was not provided. But to waive a decree on Cook's children, prohibiting access of the common people to education, this is always welcome. That is, the ruling elite of the Russian Empire did everything for the collapse of 1917, and did a lot to get Hitler to say that there are racially inferior guys living in the East who should be slaves. Especially since in the imperial times, quite a few Germans served the empire and served well. Hence, Hitler writes that the Russian Empire existed thanks to the Germanic element. And the fact that such people as Lomonosov, Suvorov were mocked and hindered, it is not customary to remember this. Moreover, you see, if we turn to the history of that time, then the level of development of military technology, it determined the organization and methods of combat training and the tactics of warfare. Well, it turned out that in the English fleet, for example, there were Marines, and one of their tasks was to pacify the command and protect it from the command of the officers. Therefore, on English ships, the bow end is the command places, the stern end is the admirals and officers, and between them is the Marines. And in order that a battleship could be governed, drilling, training was needed. The work of each crew member brought to automatism in accordance with a combat schedule or sailing schedule or some other emergency work. Fyodor Fyodorovich Ushakov, a saint of the Russian Orthodox Church, being a military sailor, during sailing exercises, every day drove sailors from starboard to port and back through the upper platforms of the mast. For information, the height of the masts of the battleship of that era above the waterline is 40 to 50 meters. So run at least from the first floor to the fifth for several hours in a row, up and down, doing push-ups 20 times on the upper platform. It will be bad right away. In 6 months you will be extremely healthy, and in addition, if you are used to looking every day from heights of 40 to 50 meters without any fall prevention, then there is hardly anything on land that can scare you. That is, speaking bluntly, Fyodor Fyodorovich was engaged in drilling. When Suvorov was building fortifications analogous to those in Izmail, and before the assault on Izmail, he drove personnel back and forth several times a day for a whole week. This was also, in fact, drilling. But when Suvorov drove, or Ushakov drove, it was not perceived as drilling by personnel. This was perceived as a necessary thing that must not be done poorly. Therefore, we could exist without the Marines, which separate the premises of the command from the premises of the officers, even though there were strata caste differences. But there were other cases when the most active fighters from among the noble officers were carefully taken by the legs and descended overboard.
аккуратно брали за ноги и спускали за борт.
There were cases when they were killed under the guise of a battle.
Пуля прилетела, и пойми, она русская или не русская.
The bullet flew in and tried to understand, is it Russian or non-Russian? This also happened.
Когда просто их закрывали своими телами. Это тоже было.
But there were other cases when they were simply covered with bodies. This also happened. Therefore, the Russian imperial elite really behaved in such a way that they created part of the prerequisites for the Second World War and Hitlerism.